In a quiet, sleepy street in the small town of Willowmere, there stood a library so old that even the oldest people in town could not remember when it was built. It was called the Maple Street Public Library, and it sat between a bakery that smelled of cinnamon rolls and a flower shop full of bright sunflowers. The library, however, did not smell of cinnamon or flowers. It smelled of something far more wonderful, the deep, warm, papery scent of 10,000 books, all whispering their stories into the air at once. The library had tall stone walls stained the color of old honey, a roof that sloped like a wizard's hat, and ivy that crept up the sides so thickly that in autumn the whole building turned blazing red and gold, as if it were on fire. The children of Willowmere called it the castle, and they were only half joking. Every child in town had been to the library at least once, but most only visited on school trips or on rainy afternoons when there was nothing else to do. Not many children went as often as 11-year-old Myra Okafor. Myra went to the library almost every single day after school. She had curly brown hair that she always tied up with a pencil stuck through it, round spectacles that she had decorated with tiny star stickers, and a worn green backpack so full of library books that it made her walk in a slightly forward-leaning tilt, like a little ship sailing into the wind. She loved all books, adventure stories, science books, poetry, cookbooks, atlases of faraway countries, but her very favorite were books about magical creatures. Dragons especially. She had read every dragon book in the library at least twice, and some of them 4 or 5 times. She could tell you the name of every dragon in every legend from every corner of the world. She could draw a dragon with her eyes closed. She dreamed about dragons at least 3 nights a week. "There's a book for every question you've ever had," the old librarian, Mr. Fenwick, always said. "And a few questions you haven't thought to ask yet." Mr. Fenwick was the librarian, and he had been the librarian at Maple Street Library for so long that he, too, seemed like part of the building. He was a small, round, cheerful man with a silver moustache that curled up at the ends, and he always wore a dark green cardigan with leather patches on the elbows. He seemed to know where every single book was without even looking. He could pluck a book from a shelf 3 rooms away without glancing up from his desk. One grey Thursday afternoon in October, when the wind was rattling the windows and piling crispy leaves against the front door, Myra arrived at the library as usual, shook the leaves off her coat, and waved to Mr. Fenwick at his desk. "Good afternoon, Myra," he said, peering over his spectacles. "Finished the Dragon Encyclopedia already?" 3 days ago, Myra said proudly, dropping her bag onto her usual table. "I've read everything you have on dragons, Mr. Fenwick. Every single book. I checked twice." Mr. Fenwick raised one eyebrow. It was the kind of eyebrow raise that meant he was thinking something interesting. "Have you now?" he said, very slowly. "Every single book." He set down his pen, stood up from his desk, and looked at her over his glasses for a long, quiet moment. "Well then, perhaps it's time you found a different sort of book." Myra frowned. "What sort?" Mr. Fenwick smiled, a slow, knowing smile, the kind that made Myra feel as though something exciting was about to happen. "The sort," he said quietly, "that finds you." He picked up his pen and went back to his papers as if he had said nothing remarkable at all. Myra stared at him for a moment, then turned and walked into the stacks, the long, tall, winding corridors of shelves that ran through the back of the library like a maze. She had walked these corridors hundreds of times. She knew every shelf, every squeaky floorboard, every corner where the light was always a little dimmer than everywhere else. And yet, that day, she turned left to the mythology section, went past the shelf of old maps and travel journals, ducked under the low wooden beam that always made tall people bump their heads, and found herself in a narrow passage she had never seen before. She stopped. She looked behind her. The mythology section was still there. She looked forward again. The passage was still there too. At the end of it, barely visible in the warm, amber light, was something she had certainly never seen in all her hundreds of visits to the library. It was a door. And on that door, carved deep into the ancient dark wood, was a dragon. Myra stood perfectly still and stared at the door. It was taller than she was, just, and made of such dark, ancient wood that it looked almost black. But it was not the darkness that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the carving. Worked deep into the wood, so detailed it looked almost alive, was a dragon. Its wings were spread wide, its long neck arched upward, and its eyes, 2 small circles of what appeared to be golden glass, seemed to catch the amber light of the library lamps and hold it, glowing softly like embers in a hearth. Around the dragon, carved in a curling spiral, were letters Myra could not read. They were not any alphabet she recognized from any of her books. They looked the way a flame looks when it rights itself in the air, all curves and sweeping strokes and little sharp flicks at the ends. Myra looked behind her again. She could still hear the familiar sounds of the library, the hum of the heating, the soft tap of Mr. Fenwick's pen, the distant rustle of someone turning pages. She had been in this building hundreds of times. She knew it the way she knew her own bedroom. There had never been a door here. There had never been this passage at all. She reached out and touched one of the carved letters. The wood was warm. Not warm the way wood gets when it's been sitting near a radiator. Warm the way a sleeping cat is warm, as if there was something living inside it. She snatched her hand back. Then, slowly, she put it out again and touched the carving of the dragon. The scales were incredibly detailed. She could feel every tiny ridge and overlap. And where her fingertips rested against the dragon's side, she felt something very faint, almost like breathing. A slow, deep rise and fall. "Hello," she said, feeling quite silly. Doors did not say hello back. But then, doors did not usually breathe either. She tried the handle. It was shaped like a small dragon curled around a bar of tarnished bronze, and it was warm too, much warmer than she expected. She turned it, very carefully, and the door swung open without a sound. Myra had expected a great creak, the dramatic groan of old hinges. Instead it moved as smoothly and silently as if it were on water. Beyond the door was light. Not the yellow electric light of the library. This was a deep, layered, complicated sort of light, golden and green at once, the way light looks when it filters through the canopy of an enormous forest. And with it came a smell, warm stone and rain and something sharp and smoky, like a bonfire made of pine trees, and underneath everything else, a smell she recognized without knowing why. Old, beautiful, ancient. Like books, but older. Like the memory of books. Myra stood in the doorway and looked into the light. Every sensible part of her brain said, "Close the door, go back to your table, tell Mr. Fenwick." That was the sensible thing to do. But Myra had read enough stories to know that you do not close a magic door when it opens for you. Magic doors open for a reason, and if you walk away, they might not be there when you come back. She took one last look over her shoulder at the warm, familiar library, at the rows of shelves, the amber lamps, Mr. Fenwick's silver head bent over his desk, and then she stepped through the door. She was 3 steps through before she realized she hadn't thought to prop it open. She turned. The door was still there, still slightly ajar. She could see the narrow passage and the edge of a bookshelf through the gap. She let out a long breath. Then the light shifted, the golden-green warmth pulsed around her like a heartbeat, and somewhere very nearby, deep, low, and utterly impossible, she heard the sound of a dragon breathing. He whirled on the other side of the door was enormous. Myra stepped out onto a cliff ledge wide enough to feel safe, and below her and around her and stretching in every direction farther than she could see was a landscape like something from the most beautiful illustration in the most beautiful book she had ever found. Mountains rose in dark, jagged lines against a sky full of stars so dense they looked like a spilled salt shaker. A moon 3 times the size of the one at home hung low and golden, and across the sky, faint ribbons of colored light drifted slowly, green and purple and gold, like the aurora borealis but softer, kinder, as if they were made of breath instead of electricity. Below the cliff was a valley of silver forest, trees she had no name for, their leaves shimmering like hammered tin. A river wound through them, and it, too, glimmered with its own faint light, as if the water itself were slightly, beautifully on fire. And above everything, moving through the star-thick sky, were dragons. There were 7 of them. Maybe more. They moved the way birds move in flocks, wheeling and turning together as if they shared a single thought, their wings spread wide against the starlight. They were all different, one blue-black like a storm cloud, one copper and gold like autumn leaves, one deep green as old jade, one pure white as snow on stone. They breathed in spirals of light rather than fire, soft, glowing exhalations that drifted upward and broke apart in the night air like dandelion seeds. Myra forgot to be frightened. She forgot everything, her backpack, her spectacles, the library, Mr. Fenwick, dinner, school tomorrow, all of it. She stood at the edge of the cliff and looked out at the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life, and tears ran quietly down her face, not from sadness but from the sheer impossible enormous fullness of it. "You came." The voice was behind her. She spun around. Standing, if standing was the right word, at the entrance to a low cave carved into the cliff face, was a dragon. Not flying, not enormous, not terrifying. It was about the size of a large pony, its scales a deep warm bronze that caught the moonlight in 100 tiny glints, its wings folded close against its sides. Its eyes were the same color as the moon, golden, steady, calm. It looked at Myra with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a visitor and is very, very pleased that they have finally arrived. "You came," it said again. Its voice was a low, rumbling, layered thing, like the sound of a cello played in a large, warm room. I was beginning to wonder if anyone ever would. Myra discovered she had completely lost the ability to speak. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She closed it again. The dragon watched her with patient golden eyes. "Take your time," it said kindly. "Most people need a moment." Myra pointed at the dragon. She pointed at the sky full of other dragons. She pointed back at the cliff behind her where the door, thankfully, was still faintly visible as a warm rectangle of golden yellow library light. She looked back at the dragon. "You're real," she managed. "Very much so," the dragon agreed. "And you can talk." All dragons can talk. We simply choose not to do it with most people. And this, Myra waved her arm at the vast, beautiful world. All of this is behind the door in the library, the dragon said, nodding slowly. "Yes. It has always been here. It was here long before the library. In fact, the library was built around the door, not the other way around. Though very few librarians have known that." Myra sat down very suddenly on the edge of the cliff. Her legs had decided they'd had enough excitement for one moment. The dragon came and settled beside her, carefully, with the deliberate gentleness of something very large that is very aware of being very large, and together they looked out at the turning dragons and the silver forest and the overflowing sky. "My name," said the dragon, after a while, "is Orin. I am the keeper of the door, and I have been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." Oren told her everything, and Myra listened the way she always listened to the very best stories, with her chin on her hands and her eyes wide and every single part of her paying absolute attention. Long, long ago, so long ago that no human knew about it, the world that dragons lived in and the world that humans lived in had not been separate at all. They had been the same world. Humans and dragons had shared mountains and rivers and valleys and skies. Dragons had been the great teachers of the ancient world. They remembered everything, could speak any language, and could see across enormous distances of both space and time. Humans had loved them and learned from them, and dragons had loved humans back, their curiosity, their creativity, their stubborn, magnificent refusal to give up on anything. But then, slowly, things had begun to change. As the centuries passed, some humans forgot how to listen, truly listen, the deep listening that lets you hear things that don't have words. They became frightened of what they didn't understand, and they began to tell stories of dragons as monsters, creatures to be slain, dangers to be defeated. The stories spread, and with the stories came fear, and with fear came real danger for the dragons, not physical danger, but something worse. When enough people stop believing something is real, it begins to fade. "Stories," said Orin gravely, "are the most powerful magic there is. They can create worlds, and they can unmake them. The stories humans told about us pushed us here, to this place between, this world that exists behind the door. We did not disappear entirely, but we became hidden." The door in the library, Orin explained, was the last great crossing point between the two worlds. There had been hundreds of doors once, scattered across the world in wild and remote places, mountain passes, the hearts of ancient forests, the depths of certain caves. One by one they had faded and closed as the old connection between humans and dragons weakened. But the library door had held, because libraries are places where stories are kept alive. As long as there were books, the door remained. "But I am a keeper without a key," said Orin, and the warm golden light in its eyes dimmed slightly, like a candle in a draught. For the door to remain open, truly open, open for others to find, a human must help. A human who reads, who listens, who believes in things before they have proof. "What do they have to do?" Myra asked. "They must learn the language of first fire," said Orin. "The oldest language in existence, the one the carved letters on the door are written in. It cannot be taught from a book. It can only be learned by listening to someone who already knows it." "You know it," said Myra. "I am the last one who does." There was a long silence. In the valley below, The silver trees murmured softly in a breeze that smelled of mountain air and very old fire. One of the great flying dragons turned overhead, its copper wings catching the moonlight, and sent a long soft curl of glowing light across the sky. "Why me?" Myra asked at last. "Why did the door open for me?" Oren looked at her for a moment with those steady golden eyes, and Myra had the peculiar feeling of being seen very completely. Not just her face and her star-stickered glasses and her slightly tilted posture from carrying too many books, but all of her, all the way through, everything she'd ever thought or wondered or hoped. "Because you have read every dragon book in that library," said Oren, "and not one of them satisfied you. Not because they were wrong, but because you knew, not in your head, but somewhere further down, that there was more. That the truth was bigger and stranger and better than any of it." Myra thought about this. She thought about lying in bed at night after finishing a dragon book, staring at the ceiling, feeling a peculiar longing she couldn't name, not for the dragons in the story, but for something behind them. Something real that the story was pointing at but couldn't quite reach. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly it." "That feeling," said Oren, "is what the door listens for." Then the great bronze dragon stretched its wings slightly, folded them again, and turned to Myra with an expression she could only describe as hopeful. "So," it said, "will you learn the language of first fire? Will you be the keeper of the door?" Myra looked out at the impossible sky, at the moonlit mountains, at the dancing shapes of dragons looping and turning among the stars. She thought of the library, warm and amber and full of books that would wait for her. She thought of Mr. Fenwick and his knowing smile. "Yes," she said, "teach me." And Oren smiled, which on a dragon looks rather alarming because of all the teeth, but which Myra had already decided to consider entirely friendly, and began. Ira came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every afternoon after school she would walk to the library, wave hello to Mr. Fenwick, who never seemed surprised to see her, and who always had a cup of hot chocolate waiting on the table by the mythology section, though she never saw him make it, walk through the winding stacks, duck under the low beam, turn left, and open the dragon door. Oren was always there, waiting in the cave mouth. And every day the great bronze dragon taught Myra the language of first fire. It was the strangest and most wonderful thing she had ever learned. The language of first fire was not made of ordinary sounds. It was made of the sounds that fire makes, and water makes, and wind makes when it moves through very old trees. It was a language of feeling as much as sound, where the meaning of a word changed not just with your voice but with your heart, with what you were truly trying to say underneath the words. "Words in first fire cannot lie," Oren told her. "Not even accidentally. If you say, 'I am brave' in first fire when you are frightened, the word for brave will not come out. It will come out as 'I am trying.' Because that is always the truth beneath the surface, and this language only carries truth." Myra found this fascinating and also slightly alarming. "What about 'I am fine' when you're not fine?" she asked. "It comes out as 'I am managing,'" said Oren, with the look of someone who had seen many humans discover this and found it consistently illuminating. Some days she sat with Oren on the clifftop and practiced making the sounds and felt them vibrate in her chest like music. Some days she walked down the winding cliff path into the silver forest and met the other dragons, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. They were all different, all extraordinary. Saril, the blue-black storm dragon, who was the oldest and said very little but always smelled of rain. Lys, the jade-green one, who was endlessly curious about everything and peppered Myra with questions about pencils and school and why humans wore shoes. Oravan, the white dragon, who was younger than the others and had an enthusiasm for doing aerial loops that occasionally alarmed everyone below. Each dragon carried its own thread of the old connection between their world and hers, like a piece of living history, warm and breathing and patient, waiting for someone to find it again. Then, on the 12th day, something went wrong. Myra arrived at the library to find the corridor to the dragon door dark. Not the usual warm amber dark of the stacks, completely dark, as if the lamps had gone out. She made her way by memory until she found the passage, and then stood in front of the door with her heart hammering. The carving of the dragon on the door had faded. The golden glass eyes, which had always glowed softly, were dark. And when she reached out and touched the wood, it was cold. She tried the handle. It turned, just, and when she pushed, the door opened, but slowly, heavily, as if it were fighting her, as if it were very tired. She stepped through to the cliff, and found Oren lying in the cave, very still, breathing slow and shallow, the bronze scales almost grey in the dim light. The great dragon opened one eye when Myra crouched beside its enormous head. What happened? Myra whispered. The door is weakening, Oren said quietly. It has held for a very long time. I have held it for a very long time. I am not as strong as I once was. Myra sat back on her heels and thought. Then she stood up. The language of first fire, she said slowly. You said it was written on the door. The words that keep the door open, Oren agreed. If someone speaks them aloud, in first fire, so they're true. Then the door will hear its own name, said Oren, and the golden light came back into its eyes, just slightly. And remember what it is. Myra walked back to the door, still on this side of it, the dragon side, the cold silver moonlit world, and put both hands flat against the carved wood. She breathed in. She thought of every book she had ever read, every story that had made her feel less alone in the world, every time a library had been a warm place to belong. She thought of all of it. And then she spoke. She spoke the words carved around the dragon, in the language of first fire. She had not known she knew them until she needed to say them. But they were there, all of them, learned without her knowing she was learning, stored somewhere deep and certain, waiting. The words came out of her in a low warm sound that seemed to come not just from her throat but from her whole self, and when they touched the carved letters, they lit up, each one separately, like stars coming on at dusk, golden and steady, and the door shuddered, and breathed, and was warm again. From that day forward, Myra Okafor was the keeper of the door. It did not come with a certificate or a badge or any other official thing. It came with a small glowing bronze scale that Oren quietly pressed into her hand one evening as she was leaving. Just one, from the side of its neck, shed naturally, given freely. So you can find the door even in the dark, Oren said. Hold it and walk. It will bring you here. It sat in the inner pocket of Myra's green backpack, warm and constant as a heartbeat, and whenever she slipped her hand in and felt it, the world seemed a little larger and more wonderful than it had a moment ago. She came to the library every afternoon that winter, and every afternoon she slipped through the door and spent an hour or two in the world beyond. She learned more of the language of first fire. She had long conversations with all the dragons, careful philosophical exchanges with old Saril about whether silence was a form of speech. He thought yes, she was still deciding. Boisterous adventures with young Oravan who insisted on teaching her to climb the silver trees, endless fascinating discussions with Liz about everything Myra took for granted in her own world, which Liz found utterly astonishing. Why did humans put pictures of important moments in frames and hang them on walls? What was a sandwich? How did a library decide which books to buy? The same way any place of importance decides what matters, Mr. Fenwick had told Myra once, when she'd asked him. It listens. A good library listens to what its people need. She had thought that very wise at the time. She thought it even wiser now. One afternoon, sitting with Oren on the cliff, Myra finally asked the question she had been carrying for weeks. Mr. Fenwick knows about the door, doesn't he? Oren's eyes glinted warmly. He found it when he was 9 years old. He's been the librarian this whole time because of the door. He chose to be. To protect the door, to tend the library, to keep the conditions right for someone like you to find it. Librarians, said Oren thoughtfully, are often the bravest sort of people. They spend their lives keeping doors open. The next day, Myra walked up to Mr. Fenwick's desk, looked him straight in the eye, and said in a perfectly ordinary voice, "Thank you for the hot chocolates." Mr. Fenwick looked back at her, and his silver moustache curved up on both sides in the widest, warmest smile she had ever seen on a human face. "Thank you for coming every day," he said. Then, after a thoughtful pause, "I shall put in a request for some more dragon books. We seem to be running low." "I think," said Myra, "we might need some new shelves altogether." He raised both eyebrows. "Oh. I've been talking to Liz," Myra said. "She'd like to write something. About dragons, from the dragon side. I told her I could transcribe if she dictated. She has a lot to say about sandwiches and framed pictures, but her ideas about memory and story and what it means to keep something alive are rather brilliant." Mr. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. His eyes were very bright behind his spectacles. "A book," he said softly, "written by a dragon. In this library." "The first of many, I should think," said Myra. "If that's all right." "That," said Mr. Fenwick, standing up from his chair with the dignity of a man who has waited a very long time for exactly this moment, "is more than all right. That is what libraries are for. He put the kettle on for hot chocolate, and Myra went to find her usual table, took out her notebook, and began to write. The library settled around her, warm and amber, full of whispered stories, humming faintly with the particular happiness of a place that is doing exactly what it is meant to do. Deep in the stacks, behind the mythology section, past the old maps, under the low beam, in the narrow passage, the dragon door stood warm and glowing, its carved letters lit in gold, its dragon eyes bright as twin stars. Open, as it would always be open now, for anyone with enough wonder in their heart to look for it. For the best doors, like the best books, are never truly closed. They wait, quietly, patiently, warmly, in the places where stories live, knowing that sooner or later, someone will come along who is ready to open them. And when that someone arrives, the door will swing wide, and everything, absolutely everything, will begin.